Hi everyone again. This is part 3 of the lecture on the global economy. So we covered in first segment was economy, society, and culture. Then the second segment was the global economy and history. And in this segment, I will continue to talk about anthropology of global capitalism. So how do anthropologists study global capitalism? In the last segment, I talked about this one example that was groundbreaking in teaching us how to study capitalism through multi-sided research. And then today I will continue to talk about how do we study global capitalism today. So first of all, in understanding capitalism today, we have this paradigm that was designed by geographer / anthropologist David Harvey. And David Harvey is one of the contemporary theorists of globalization and capitalism and neoliberalism, of which I'll talk in a few minutes. And he defines these 4 aspects of globalization and capitalism. And it's important to know these 4 aspects because, you've heard the term globalization, I'm sure, before thrown around. But if someone asks you a question, what do you mean by globalization? Sometimes we don't know how to answer. And so this sort of gives you a template to think about globalization. So there are 4 aspects of globalization that Harvey talks about. First is time-space compression. Second is flexible accumulation. Third, increasing migration. And fourth, uneven development. So I'm going to go through each of these aspects of globalization and talk about them. These are discussed in your textbook as well. But it's important that you learn how to distinguish these 4 aspects of globalization. And you will be asked questions in your final exam, online, Blackboard, just like midterm. There'll be a lot of questions about these 4 terms. So these are important concepts to take away from this lecture. Okay, so by time-space compression, we refer to the increased speed of communication, transportation, and exchange. So if you think about, and we're talking about the last maybe 40 to 50 years, some of these things go a little bit earlier, but if you think about it, air travel has become much more common and much more expansive, right? So that's one example of transportation becoming, making time and space more compressed, right? So it's faster now to go from one continent to the other than it was 100 years ago. Communication is another aspect of globalization. It's so much easier now to get in touch with people from all corners of the world through the internet, through email. I'm using WhatsApp every day to talk to my parents who live in Albania and are in worse lockdown than us right now. And I thank WhatsApp for that. So the internet plays an important role in this increased speed of communication, in this time-space compression. Again, you have to compare it back to when communication across distances took place through mail or phone, telephone, right? So other ways of communicating that were either slower or had less access. Same thing with exchange. So trade, the way that goods travel, but also the way that financial transactions take place nowadays, they also take place through these digital mediums. So you could transfer money from one place to the other very quickly through these, for instance, through PayPal or through a bank transfer, right? So that's another example of the time-space compression. So basically what Harvey is saying, what we're saying is that it's this time-space compression that has happened because of the increased speed of communication, transportation, and exchange, that we have this new phase of globalization, right? That communities are connected with each other, people are connected with each other over really long distances. The second aspect of globalization is flexible accumulation. We'll talk a lot about this. So flexible accumulation basically refers to this process whereby the global production and circulation of labor and goods has been sort of spread over the world. It used to be that you had a factory that say made cars, right? So the Ford factory, it would be based in one town, and all parts of production would take place within this one factory. Whereas in contemporary, after the 70s, I'll explain the history of this, but after the 70s, there was this big switch from that form of production, industrial production, to a more flexible production that entailed companies sending parts of their labor and parts of the manufacturing abroad. So for instance, setting up manufacturing firms, first in Mexico, where labor was cheaper, and then in China, and then in other Southeast Asian countries or other developing countries around the world, is part of this flexible accumulation. It's cheaper for companies to hire workers in other countries where labor standards are lower, where wages are lower, and so that they can increase their profit margins. Now, flexible accumulation was made possible by government regulations, right? So governments eased their regulations on tariffs and on trade, and so that made it possible for companies to set up shop in these other places. Now, a consequence of that has also been increased migration. So migration refers to people moving from one place to the other for different reasons. We'll talk more about this next week. But all you need to know for now is that basically migration or movement of people has increased in the last 50 to 100 years. And this migration refers both to internal migration, so people moving within the country. So for instance, people from rural areas moving to cities, to these jobs created by outsourcing, or people moving to other countries. And then the final aspect of globalization is uneven development. So as the circulation is happening, as flexible accumulation is taking place, what we see is actually an increase of inequality between the rich and the poor. Now, this uneven development happens on the global scale, but it also happens nationally. So there's been a lot of studies about increasing inequality in the last 40, 50 years within the United States, within Western Europe, but also globally, right? So these are four aspects of globalization, right? So these are, when we talk about globalization, we think about these four things, and we think about these four aspects that have created a new global dynamic in which we live in today. Now I'm going to focus a little bit more on another term that you might have heard, or you will hear a lot, that describes this phase of capitalism of the last 30, 40 years. And this is the term neoliberalism. Now, neoliberalism refers to this different phase of capitalism that has developed with these changes in market and in globalization. So anyway, so what we refer to by neoliberalism is a kind of capitalism that emphasizes even more free market and minimal government intervention. It also involves a lot of this idea of the entrepreneurial self. So things like Uber and Lyft, where people can sort of plug in and be a part of that economy, but where they also don't get benefits or don't have any safety net, right? But you feel like you're being entrepreneurial, and the economy pushes you to do that. But on the flip side of that is that you're not having the kind of social security that you used to have with, let's say, a union job as a taxi driver, a regular yellow cab. So that's another aspect of neoliberalism, is this push away from sort of regulated, socially supported measures on labor towards more of this sort of flexible but unsecure kind of labor. And so historically, We talk about neoliberalism as rising since the 70s, and the sort of the beginnings of this phase are the 1970s, when Donald Reagan was the President of the United States, Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of the UK. They both began to implement these regulations that were deregulating the economy, lowering these tariffs on trade. They're also cutting down on welfare state, right, on social services. And so now this happened over a period of time, and we still see that a lot of this has been happening in the last decade. For instance, a lot of discussion about cutting Medicaid or Medicare or Social Security are part of this neoliberal movement. Now, you also know that there's also been a backlash on that, as we see that a lot of these benefits that we took for granted are being eroded. So anyway, but what I wanted to make sure that you focus on this notion of neoliberalism and understand that this is another form of capitalism, right? But it is a specific form, and it's related to this particular history. And it is pertinent to us today, because we can really say that our economy is more of a neoliberal type of economy. Now, to explain the sort of differences between sort of a more liberal capitalism and neoliberalism, I want to take this example of move my camera. So the Fordism to flexible accumulation. So Fordism is a notion, is associated with the kind of big factories of big American and other European firms, coming out of World War II especially, and actually even before that. So in the 30s, you have this workers' movements that are pushing back against management and forcing management to have certain protections for their workers, such as the 9-to-5 workday, the weekend, right? Having the right to have a union, and then the union negotiating with management on salaries and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's still part of the capitalist system, but it's a capitalist system that's organized in what we call the Fordist model. So this term comes from the Ford factory, the assembly line factory, these industrial factories that are engaged in mass production, but they usually operate within the nation, the same country where the headquarters of the company are situated. And then this also refers to a phase of capitalism where there's a lot of strong policies to protect the workers, such as the healthy living wage, 8-hour working day, and so on and so forth. And so we saw that we had this, right? This was the general model of capitalism in the United States, in Western Europe, from the early 20th century through the middle of the 20th century. And then, as I mentioned earlier, in the 70s, we started to see disintegration of that system, right? So, and that's the phase of flexible accumulation that I mentioned earlier, or neoliberalism. So what happened in that time, to repeat it again, corporations sought to maximize profit by all necessary means. And so governments eased some of the regulations that kept labor nationally, right? And capital, we didn't talk about this, but capital also was sort of more controlled. You couldn't really move your money out so easily. So there's two aspects of flexible accumulation. On one hand, it's outsourcing, so hiring low-wage laborers in peripheral countries or countries with weaker states. And then the other aspect of this is offshoring, so allowing companies to put their savings or their profits in offshore centers where they can avoid paying taxes like the rest of us, right? So anyway, so both of these movements then lead to what we've talked about, which is uneven development. So anyway, I want to make sure that you can see that both of these models are part of capitalism, right? So capitalism is a sort of broad term general term, but there's different variations within it. And people who study capitalism or neoliberalism and who study these transformations will try to understand, what does this shift from Fordism to flexible accumulation mean for different people, right? What does it mean for people who live in Detroit or Baltimore, where we've seen a lot of deindustrialization, right? That we call the white flight, the leaving of these big factories, and the sort of end of this working class type life. And then on the other hand, you have these developments in other parts of the world where you have this reindustrialization, but it's an industrialization in a neoliberal form. So speaking of that, my next slide is introducing a short video. And I'm only going to play this first video, but this is an example or a sort of insight into what works and labor looks like from the perspective of these outsourced factories. So in this short video, we are presented with some questions and challenges that workers in China are experiencing. This is a little bit of an old video, actually, a few years back, but the situation is pretty much the same, not only in China now, but a lot of other Southeast Asian countries around China where labor is even cheaper. So before I play this video, I want you to think a little bit about where your clothes are made and who makes them. And then to add to that, where is your cell phone made? Right? And can you think, or can you imagine, what are their lives like, the people who are making these commodities that you consume every day? So you can think about that question while I create the link to the video. And hopefully this is gonna work this time. Okay.
3的这里面的线也要剪，一条裤子从头到尾一共要剪30分钟，1个钟头才剪2件。用这个来刷，要这里面都要刷。还有就是用这个大呀，这个石头一样不费小时啊，挣4、5毛钱。
particularly human resources 嘅，特別係啲人啊。係啊係啊係。They come from other parts of the country and live in here. 佢係咪由中國第啲地方外省嚟呢度做嘢嘅？係啊。Yes, they come from out of the province. Yeah.
Oh, they can go back to their place to eat. How convenient.
You want to go to canteen and eat?
Try. No, but it's convenient for them. So they make more money. Yeah, so they're happy. Yeah, exactly. It's good for them. Yeah, right.
在歐洲南美洲
We're beginning to tackle the North American, Canada, and U.S. market in the second half of 2003. We're only beginning. Yes.
We're very impressed with what we see, and we hope it will lead to a lot more trade and between ourselves. So, again, thank you for having us here. Thank you.
这3年来，我跟我的团队也经过100多个工厂来做有关劳工问题的调查、工人的培训、管理人员的培训和工厂审核工作。你们拍的厂要比一般的厂要好一些，因为看非常整洁。跨公司有非常多的 monitor 过来检查，但是他们很难能发现问题，因为在他们到来之前，一般都会通知工厂，工厂也都教了工人怎么对付他们。实际上是跨公司跟工厂都在玩一个游戏，他们都知道，所以跨公司的首要任务是要对付消费者，而并不是说真正考虑怎么样改善工人的权益。
他会叫每一个工人下去的，那他怕我们说出其实的工厂出来了，他就在写字楼打了一份资料发给我们给教工人，教下面的组长，教他们怎么说上班时间有没有那个休息时间，有没有上厕所，可不可以随便上厕所，不可以随便上厕所的，一个班就可以上2次厕所。我本来只有300块，那一份给我签的，主管拿给我签的那一份，我有800块，那是假的。
看到那个例外这样的牌子的名牌了，一般的反正都是祝你们美国的获利再占90%。今天呢，假如你说你做厂里加班辛苦了，那个客户呢他不会拿这么多活给你做，反正都是围着这一家人搞，你是这样的，反正你老板都没有活了，我们职工呢都没有搞的了，是这样的。
与客户中国人吧，他来看的时候是看产品的质量好坏与劳作好不卫生，就是4要16嘛。有时候是属于两个还是好了，那卡有一张卡呢，工人自己打的卡，要不然来凭着这个保安来找人打电话，这个假卡呢。
大部分打不下来反正都是为了应付，反正你们可以就可以了。
中国的国家人吧，这个是按照电视的话来是主要来自于挺国外的同学，这个但是我主要的时候并不是为了我自己的利益，而是为了所有的打工仔。
All right, so I hope that you could hear that well. Actually, if you are having trouble watching any of these videos, just know that the link will be on the slide, so you can also go and watch it there if it's easier, and if it's sorry, I'm trying to fix the audio. Hopefully you can hear me, so I'm just going to repeat this. So if you are having trouble watching this video, you can also click to the link on the slides that are going to be up on Blackboard as well. And then the second link is to another video from a little bit closer to our present, which talks a little bit about the labor organizing in China. And sometimes we think about other places, right? We hear a lot, we see a lot of negative press on China regarding labor conditions and work there, and also suppression of human rights and information, which is all true. But one of the things that we don't hear a lot about is how people there react and how do they resist the government. So I invite you to see the second video. It's quite inspiring. It's because you can see that there's a lot of labor organizing. There are people who are trying to change things there. Okay, so let me ask you a couple of questions about this video. So this was an example, right, of, as I mentioned, of an outsourced company in textiles. So it's an example of the flexible accumulation concept we've been talking about. So let me ask you the question, how has flexible accumulation shaped labor dynamics in China? And then secondly, just even, I mean, I know this is a very short video, it's not a lot of context, but what are some of the signs of uneven development explored in these videos? I'll let you think about it for a little bit. So again, flexible accumulation and uneven development. How does this example speak to these concepts? So when we talk about flexible accumulation, one of the things we noticed in this video is that workers in textile factories that are featured there work long hours, right? They work in crowded spaces, they have no rights, and they do not gain a living wage. So they're living in very minimal living conditions. Another part that you don't know, but you should sort of deduce from the context that I've been giving you is that a lot of these workers are actually internal migrants. So there are workers that are coming from other parts of China looking for jobs in the cities. And then the second aspect relates more to the role that states play in enabling flexible accumulation. So in this case, you have states like China and Canada, because the corporation we're looking at is a Canadian one. These two states play a role in this global economy by creating the conditions for outsourcing, for flexible accumulation. So China enables these poorly paid, very exploitative labor practices in its country. And then Canada or the United States or Europe allows their companies to go out and have different standards, have different wages for people working in factories abroad, right? As a way for them to make bigger profit margins. Now to the second question of uneven development, you can clearly see here that on one hand, the workers in China are clearly at the bottom of the pyramid. They're paid less than workers in the United States or in other Western countries. While on the other hand, you see Western companies, but it doesn't have to be just Western companies, some global companies, multinationals that are making a high profit margin by paying people so low, right? So it's this dynamic, right, these two extremes that are an example of uneven development, right, where you have this increasing inequality over time. So I'm going to close it at this for this lecture, and I hope that you can go over some of these concepts. As I mentioned earlier, the slides will be on Blackboard, and please also look out for an activity that I will post that relates to the topic of globalization. But the activity will focus on alternatives to globalization and to neoliberalism and alternatives to sort of this neoliberal kind of capitalism. And it will talk about fair trade. So I will post that online too. There'll be a little bit of me talking, but then the activity itself will be in a sheet that you can complete and return through Blackboard. Okay, well, let me know if you have any questions, and we'll talk to you next week about migration, which is also a part of the global economy chapter, but I have saved it separately on Blackboard as well. Okay, well, stay safe and sane this week, and let me know if you have any questions. I will create a discussion board for people who have questions about the topic and the lectures. Have a good week, everybody.